Evelyn, thank you so much. And friends, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, and most importantly, the remarkable Dog Fellows. What a great pleasure and honor it is to be here together with you. And what a special honor after hearing the eloquence and the power and the commitment of the fellows. I think we should give them another round of applause. They really exemplify what the world needs in journalism, and that is people who are fiercely intelligent and fiercely committed to telling the truth and helping all of us to understand the complexity of events. We live in a world where we have a lot of direct images coming at us at all times now, and even where the profession of journalism is finding it very hard to compete against the millions of bloggers who don't have the skills, the talent, the temperament, the knowledge, the base to get the story right. And so in this world where sometimes it's thought, well, journalism is perhaps less important than it used to be, it's of course far more important. We're surrounded by noise and confusion, and understanding the deeper truths is all the more difficult and all the greater challenge of journalism. So it's really a very special privilege for me to have a chance to thank you and also to be a small part of the Dag Hammarskjöld program, which is a remarkable program, and I hope that we all support in the coming years. Listening to all of the fellows, of course, reminded me of the wonders that one does experience in this unique city, the good and, of course, with the recent events, the very difficult. Asma talked about the cab drivers. I had exactly the experience yesterday. I just stepped in a cab in Columbus Circle, and without missing a beat, the cab driver said, "Mr. Sachs, I've been hoping to talk to you." Honestly, I said, "Oh, yes." He said, "Yes, I'm from Bosnia, and I was there in 1992 when you were dealing with Ante Markovic, and I just wanted to ask you a question." And it was as if it was the most natural thing in the world, as our cabs are. All that the fellows said about all of the experiences, including the remarkable social capital of this city and how it's faced this recent stress is remarkable. We didn't have looting and rioting and terrible things. We had a lot of common purpose and building. Of course, we also had some dire reminders of our vulnerability, which I think we had forgotten. And as a country, we had forgotten. It was a sad fact that during the presidential campaign, up until the hurricane, the term climate change probably was mentioned fewer than half a dozen times. And it wasn't as if we didn't have enough warning even before the hurricane that this should have been a central topic of our leadership campaign, because the United States this year, even before the hurricane, was experiencing the worst drought in its modern history, an extreme drought that stretches over half of the geographic area of the 48 states, and it was experiencing the warmest temperature on history. We've had the warmest consecutive 12 months on the instrument history of the United States from July 2011 to July 2012. July 2012 was the single warmest month in American history. And we are on track for 2012 worldwide to be the warmest year in recorded history. And yet, even with all of this provocation, and with all of the dire consequences, with the food supply that is under unprecedented stress again, crop failures that had taken about 20 to 25% of our soybean production and our maize production this year. Obvious devastation in other parts of the world. I spent a lot of the last year in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, two regions that are reeling from drought themselves, and where a drought without question had contributed to the Mali disaster, the coup and the rebellion. It wasn't the sole cause, but it was part of the trigger, and it was part of the amplifier of that crisis. Even with all of this, we didn't find a way to talk about climate change until another disaster struck, and then Mayor Bloomberg did something absolutely remarkable, which was to put it front and center of the campaign in the final days. And that really was about as deft a political touch as one could imagine, to take the theme and not only to center it, but to make it the very centerpiece of the closing days of the election. Now, ironically, this storm did put me in a very odd position, almost a climate denier position, I have to say, because I appear roughly once a week on television saying climate change is real, it's dramatic, we have to face it, it's an urgent crisis, it's going to get a lot worse, the trends are very adverse. And as Hurricane Sandy was approaching, because I am the luckiest person in the world to be directing a wonderful institute filled with real experts who know seemingly everything about everything, I was able to call the hurricanologist at the Earth Institute, a brilliant atmospheric physicist, and get a play-by-play action of this storm. And I said to him, Dr. Sobel, is this climate change? And he said, probably not. It's probably a very extreme storm, but we don't have the tools, we don't have the modeling to say that this particular storm is so serious because of climate change. It's a very unusual event of a tropical storm hitting an extratropical trough, as it was called, slamming right into a vulnerable part of the East Coast. I queried him by the hour roughly every day, and he held to his line that we don't know, but you can't really say it. And my rule as the non-scientist director of a scientific institution of hundreds of scientists is listen to what your scientists say. So there I was on Morning Joe the next morning after the hurricane, and Joe Scarborough very, very nicely threw me the biggest softball one can imagine. And he said, so Jeff, as you've been saying every week on this show for years, here it is. And I said, Joe, probably not. And his eyes nearly popped out. And he said, what? I said, well, on this case, we can't really know. Now, let me qualify that actually just in a quite serious way. The storm itself was an extraordinarily unusual, terrifying event. What is undoubted in all seriousness is that the storm surge has what we call an anthropogenic dimension to it, a human-caused dimension. Not only do we choose to build the greatest cities of the world on the coasts, because that's where trade is, and it's been that way for hundreds of years, but as everybody knows, the ocean level, the sea surface has risen by nearly a foot during the past century, and that is undoubtedly human-induced climate change. The water is warming, and that causes thermal expansion, and the ice sheets are thinning, and the glaciers are melting and disappearing. So the amount of water in the ocean basins is rising, and the water expands as it warms, and there's a lot more of that to come. This was a storm of unusual ferocity, and where we can't necessarily pin attribution to it, but combined with the high sea level, the vulnerability of our coastline, there's no doubt First, that there is a human dimension to the damages and to the risks, and second, that this is exactly the kind of event that we can expect to occur more frequently in the future. This summer, another of my scientist guru colleagues that many of you will know, Dr. James Hansen, who is arguably the most important climate scientist in the world, the chief of NASA's climate science, and NASA very kindly put an institute on the Columbia University campus as part of the Earth Institute, the Goddard Institute of Space Studies. So we call Dr. Hansen one of our own. He published a very terrifying paper, actually, called The Climate Dice, Rolling the Climate Dice, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. What he showed in the most meticulous way is that what used to be extreme events of temperature, heat waves, and precipitation are the new normal. What used to occur only one time out of 1,000 in terms of temperature extremes now occurs 50 to 100 times out of 1,000. So we've entered a new era. And as many of you know, the geologists have even given it a new name. In traditional geology, we are living in the Holocene. That means the period after the Ice Age. The Pleistocene became the Holocene. But according to the scientists, we've entered a new era, which has been christened the Anthropocene. Greek meaning the human-caused era of the planet. We've entered a period in which the major Earth systems, of course, climate, hydrology, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, fundamental parts of the Earth's operating systems and biosphere are now under human-induced control. Not control, thoughtful control, under the power of the human weight of 7 billion of us and a $70 trillion world economy. And greenhouse gases continuing to rise as they did last year to record levels, another 3.5% increase, 34 billion tons of carbon dioxide emitted from fossil fuel use and cement production last year, unprecedented in the scale. And we are already in the era of profound risk, profound instability, and the new norm of extreme events. So finally, how do we look ahead and how do we save ourselves? And how do we break out of what has been a trap of politics so extreme that we can't even mention extreme events? So bizarre that we can't even mention climate change in a national presidential election campaign. So odd that even when the two candidates debate energy policy for 10 minutes in the second debate, not one of them dared to say carbon emissions, not one of them dared to say low carbon energy, not one of them dared to say climate change. What do we do? How do we get out of this? In Rio this past June, the world's governments came together on the anniversary of the Earth Summit of 1992. Of course, it was the Rio Plus 20 anniversary. The report card of Rio was damning. I think we can't use any less expression, because Rio had inaugurated 3 brilliant treaties on climate change, biodiversity, and desertification, and not one of them has been implemented during the past 20 years. Not one of them has even come close to being implemented.